Greetings, I'm Bill Everett, and on behalf of the Friends of Chamber Music, welcome to this special episode of Chamber Conversations, Lessons and Carols, a Victorian Christmas tradition. We're in the beautiful Church of St. Mary Magdalene in Oxford, in England, and I'm delighted to have two members of Stile Antico. We'll hear about their program titled A Renaissance Christmas, a sequence of music and poetry inspired by the service of 9 lessons and carols. We'll also be exploring some of the defining features of Renaissance music with members of the ensemble and also relish in performances of some of this sublime music. And I'm delighted to be here today with two members of Stile Antico, Helen Ashby and Will Dawes.
Hello.
Thank you.
Lovely to be here.
Thanks for joining us. So first of all, how did you come up with this idea of a Renaissance Christmas based on 9 lessons and carols?
Well, it's kind of one of those things that was sort of born out of the pandemic, really. We usually, as professional singers, are singing in various other places as well as with the group. We normally spend December kind of tearing around between various churches, singing endless 9 lessons and carol services, which is a very popular form of carol services, certainly in Britain. And obviously last year that almost completely stopped. And we suddenly found that while we used to moan about it all the time in the old days, we actually really missed it. And it's such a lovely format that sort of takes you through the whole story from the very beginning, starts with Adam and Eve and goes through to the birth of Christ and then the Nativity and the visit of the Magi. So it's such a nice way of sort of encapsulating the whole story of Christmas. And so we thought it'd be a nice way of kind of structuring a program, a new Christmas program.
And how did you choose some of the particular repertoire that you're singing and also some of the readings?
Yeah, the repertoire choice, we've actually recorded 3 separate Christmas discs, which we kind of based around countries. So we did an English Christmas first, then we've done one based around German and Flemish music, and then more recently a Spanish one. So we sort of picked our favourite bits and pieces, a bit of a European tour of our favourite Christmas music, but obviously we chose specifically pieces of music that reflected the readings. So we've gone along with the main structure of the normal reading. So in a standard 9 lessons and carols, there are set readings that go through the story, as I said. But we thought rather than going with the traditional readings that are all biblical, that are very well known, we actually went through and chose poetry and prose from the Renaissance, from the time of the music, that reflected those readings and had sort of echoes and explored the same themes as each of the readings.
That sounds wonderful because, of course, this idea of a 9 lessons and carols is a Victorian tradition. It's something developed in the 19th century and seems fascinating that so much of nowadays what we might consider part of Christmas, so much of it is Victorian. Charles Dickens' A Christmas Carol, which in Kansas City, there's a performance of that every year at Christmas time, a dramatic version of that. There's, of course, the idea of the Christmas tree, which Prince Albert, Queen Victoria's consort, brought from Germany, been here earlier with Queen Charlotte, but this notion, Christmas cards, is a Victorian tradition, and even the idea of a Christmas carol, without this idea of sort of this popular song that people would sing going from house to house or in public spaces, and then that coming into the church, as it were, through this idea of these 9 lessons and carols, which actually started in 1880 at Truro Cathedral. And then there were others. I mean, Will, you were mentioning at Brown University.
Yes, absolutely. It's popularly sort of believed that 9 lessons and carols is a sort of a copyrighted institution from King's College, Cambridge. And quite rightly, their performance of it every year is something that the whole world needs to see. But they weren't the first people to do it, and it was the Dean of Truro, you just mentioned his name, Mr. Benson, who started off this idea, and then Brown University had an idea to do it as well. And then finally, then next, King's Cambridge.
Later, yes. Yeah, well, that's wonderful because part of this too is there were people thinking that a way to teach people about what is the Christmas story was to use music they were familiar with, and so that was a reason to create this service. So there was sort of this educational aspect.
It is really a quite extraordinary mix of words and music. It gives an awful lot of time for reflection on both the words and the music. And the congregation's role, aside from singing the hymns, is to sort of contemplate as opposed to actively pray. I mean, there's the Lord's Prayer at the very beginning, but then the rest of it, apart from the hymns, the congregation is silent.
And also with that too, thinking about, you mentioned King's College, Cambridge, and their first service was in 1918 during World War I, the Great War, this time of tremendous uncertainty, and people are wondering what's going on around us. We've had to change our usual way of life so dramatically, and what's going to happen after this. And so many resonances with where we are
today,
nowadays.
Absolutely.
In this regard. And also something happening in the church with that, because we could almost think of this Lessons and Carols service as being this sacred response to some of these more secular traditions. I mentioned Dickens, a Christmas tree, and so forth. But we have some changes taking place within the church, and we're in the wonderful city of Oxford, and the Oxford movement, which would have a significant impact on the Church of England. Well, can you tell us a little bit about that? Because that's this exact same time period.
Absolutely. So the Oxford movement took place in the early 1840s when a group of Anglican men felt slightly jaded by what the Anglican Church was offering. And this was known as the Tractarian movement, people who wrote tracts sort of expressing their feelings on a theological basis. So the four most well-known people were John Henry Newman, Gerald Manley Hopkins, John Keble, and Edward Pusey. And as it turns out, Newman and Manley Hopkins couldn't quite get their point across, so eventually converted to Roman Catholicism, whereas John Keble and Edward Pusey sort of led this Anglo-Catholic idea forward, so much so that Keble College, Oxford, is named after John Keble, and Pusey House, less than 100 yards up the road from where we are now, is named after Edward Pusey. One of the really interesting things about Anglo-Catholicism was this idea of going back to things in the past which they revered. And in fact, this building we're in now dates from the time of the Oxford movement, whilst there was a place of worship on this site from the early 1000s. It's been remodeled and renovated and bits added to it and removed, but what we're looking at right now dates from about 1841 to 1843. And it was the first Gothic interior that was sort of revived. So what you have in here is the first interior Gothic sort of renovation. And it's that idea of harking back to olden times, and this idea of image as well. There's a lot of sort of iconography and image around the building, which feels only what an Anglo-Catholic church could really look like.
Yes, and like you said, this is an Anglo-Catholic church. And you're the music director here.
I am.
So you've told us some about the history of the building already, but some of the things that happen here that are distinctive.
Yeah, I'm lucky to have been the director of music here for the last 10 years. There's a great sense of drama about the liturgy, particularly the Triduum on Maundy Thursday, Good Friday, and Holy Saturday. You really feel as though you're taking part in something dramatic and a recreation of what actually happened in the original Triduum. But nowadays, it's a modern church. It's about just over halfway up the candle, shall we say. There's a lot of bells and smells. There are female priests as well. We treat everyone with respect, and it's a well-used and well-loved church. An interesting fact is that the Tallis Scholars had their first ever concert where we're sitting right now, when Peter Phillips was a student at St. John's College just up the road.
It's interesting. And one thing that we've been alluding to, you mentioned this is a very contemporary church, and here we have it built during the 19th century, and with the Oxford movement having this veneration for the distant past. And this seems, to me, so much of what you're doing in your program. You're looking at music from the 15th and 16th centuries, performing it within a framework devised during the 19th century for 21st century audiences.
Yeah, sure. It's kind of being part of a living tradition, using things that, from all through the different centuries, but it can create a new sort of tradition.
And thinking about this, for you, be fascinating to hear for you personally, for the ensemble as a whole, what is it about this music of the Renaissance that you find so appealing, and what makes it relevant, or continues to make it relevant perhaps, for audiences in the 21st century?
I find one of the things I love most about this repertoire is it's so magical to have music that's just made by voices. So it's just a cappella, and that's just in itself is already something so magical. And then to be part of something that has been a tradition for so long is a really sort of special feeling, and to keep that music alive and keep it relevant and keep it part of the living liturgy and in concert performances as well. And also one of the other fantastic things about this repertoire is that the composers were singers themselves. So all of the composers, Byrd and Palestrina and Tallis, they were all primarily singers. And you can really tell that in the way that they write the vocal music. It's so lovely to sing because they knew how to write for voices so well.
I think there's also something entirely relevant about the themes. We look at a lot of the Christmas music about the coming of a new hope and someone who can lead us. And that particular theme is relevant from the birth of Christ to the first episode of Star Wars. I mean, there's a real sensation that we're looking for something that's a bit more refreshing. And secondly, I think the music itself, there's this image of some people of when you say, oh, we sing early music, an image of sort of monks in cassocks smacking themselves over the head with a psalter or something like that. Whereas actually the vibrancy of the music, particularly such as in William Byrd's Rorate Celi, is absolutely thrilling to sing, and the harmonies are wonderful. And Byrd only sets one melisma per word, so it feels very active and not very reflective. You do feel actually involved very much in the music.
And now we have a performance of that piece. William Byrd's music is absolutely glorious. There's no two ways about it. Just how he combines this idea of imitation, where the different members of the ensemble are imitating, as it were, exchanging vocal lines. And then these sections of what we might call homophony, everyone singing together, and how he goes so seamlessly between those, really quite spectacular.
It's as effortless as a sort of flock of birds changing direction. I don't know how they do that en masse, and I don't know how Byrd writes such amazing music, particularly the beginning of the Gloria, where I'm lucky in this scoring that the baritones get the best bit around Spiritu Sanct with this sort of flickering flame of a vocal line.
Right, and to be thinking too that he is writing this music in isolation. And here we think about the COVID-19 pandemic and people working in isolation. But of course with William Byrd, he's Roman Catholic, and he's working at a time when being Catholic was illegal after the 1559 Act of Uniformity, and so was having to write his Latin sacred music in secret for performances in Catholic masses that would be held in secret. So this idea of the splendid human creativity in these extraordinary circumstances. Again, something else to think about that makes Byrd's music so relevant to us today, just this idea of what one can achieve under extraordinary circumstances. But thinking more about how some of this music works, I'd like to get into a little bit more technical things on sort of looking under the hood, as it were, as to what makes this music work. And one piece that's featured on your latest CD and also on your program that we'll be hearing is Josquin's Ave Maria. One of the most famous pieces, certainly, of all music coming from this Renaissance era. And sort of thinking about how it works a little bit. We heard with William Byrd that idea of imitation, where we have the same part going from voice to voice. This is exactly what Josquin does at the beginning of his Ave Maria, where he's going to offer the same musical idea presented first in the top voice, a soprano, then alto, then tenor, then bass. And then he goes back and introduces a second musical idea and does the exact same thing, the four entries imitating one another. And these ideas are so well balanced because the first one on the text Ave Maria has a more ascending feel to it. We're going upwards with it, the general gesture. So it's sort of like we've got this cascade of things. And then the second idea is a more descending line, more scalar, more stepwise motion. And these two contrasting ideas, they complement each other so beautifully. So what we're going to do now is listen to an excerpt, a performance of the beginning of music that Josquin wrote, but I'm going to tell you not exactly how he wrote it, because we're going to hear how a very ordinary composer would create this opening to have that imitative polyphony on one phrase. Once it finishes, we hear the second one. So we heard this idea of finishing one, starting the other. Works perfectly well. Nope, it's sort of what you would read in a textbook, sort of how to do this, how a person would be taught to do polyphony. Do this part, do that part. But sometimes we might want those phrases to overlap a bit. And that creates this more seamless texture. This is something we heard a lot in the Byrd piece. We'll hear it in the Josquin as well. So now we're going to hear this piece, again, this opening, but this time, when the basses get to their final pitch, that's when the sopranos are going to start that second section. So we do have this overlap that is taking place, this elision of these two musical ideas.
Ave
But this is Josquin, and Josquin is an extraordinary composer. I mean, he's writing for a Catholic service, and we have Martin Luther, the founder of Protestantism, as it were, in at least the German tradition with that, saying that Josquin made the notes do what he wanted them to do, not what the notes wanted to do themselves. And we hear this innovation because Josquin is going to have that second part, that descending line, enter very soon after the basses enter with their statement of that first idea. So what he's doing is this overlap is taking place, where the first idea, that imitation is still taking place, and the second idea becomes superimposed. Let's hear this. And if we're wondering why we spend so much time with the music of Josquin, this is why. What we heard earlier is what probably most, frankly, composers of the Renaissance would do, or certainly many of them. But what makes Josquin special is his compositional innovation, as we just heard in this absolutely extraordinary opening. Josquin does another type of imitation that was very popular at the time, and that is the idea of paired imitation. And this is, well, during the rehearsal, you were talking about this idea of a pair of pairs, which is exactly what is happening, where we have the four different voice types, the four vocal parts, which we've just heard in this four-part imitation, now divided into pairs, where we have one pair has a duet, and then the other pair enters imitating that duet. Another hallmark of music of this time. Let's hear a passage of this paired imitation that occurs in the middle part of Josquin's Ave Maria. So this is how sections in a piece of Renaissance music often begin, this idea of these imitative openings, after which this web of polyphony is created that brings us to a cadence or a closing point. Sometimes what will happen is we'll have that definite cadential feel, there'll be a slight pause, and then the next section begins. Sometimes, as we heard in the opening example, we have this elision or this overlapping. One way in which contrast can be created is by changing the way time is being organized. We have, as it were, these two pulse units that we've been hearing, this bomb, bomb, very regular feel. But what happens? We can change that. So rather than having this organization into, as it were, these two beats or pulses, we can change it into three, creating this idea of contrast. And we're going to hear a passage momentarily where Josquin does just this. Something I want you to notice also is how we've got this wonderful web, as it were, of polyphonic voices. These four different parts acting independently, imitating one another. Listen especially, there's this descending line that occurs, and you're going to hear that pass between the different voices in the ensemble. The intensity grows and grows during this until we reach this cadence. So we've just heard how these four voices are moving at roughly the same speed all together, but with this idea of this imitation, that independence. This is hearkening towards another style that is used in music of the Renaissance, again to create contrast with the imitation, homophony, or all the voices moving together at the same time. This is where, because we don't have that intricate interweaving of lines, the music can feel perhaps more static, more contemplative, and really allow for moments of reflection. This is exactly what Josquin does at the very end of his Ave Maria, where he offers us this idea of solace and a moment to reflect. As hopefully you've realized in our short time, this exploration of looking at why Josquin, sort of these extraordinary things that Josquin does in his music that make it so exciting to listen to and to perform. And you've spent a lot of time with Josquin recently, correct?
Yeah, we've been spending a lot of time with Josquin's music over the last few years. We made a recording of his music in July last year, and this is quite simply called Josquin, the Golden Renaissance, and it's on Decca Classics, and it's our first of a 3-disc relationship with Decca. Next, we'll be recording music by William Byrd, and then the music of Palestrina to celebrate major anniversaries. But as you say, his music is amazing. The Missa Pange Lingua, which just has all these wonderful inventive uses of the hymn tune as it goes through. There are other masses by Josquin as well. There's 2 which are strict canonic masses, which again gives a fantastic example of his genius compositional level.
Right, so this idea of a canon just being really this very formulaic type of imitation. I mean, the rules that are required with that are sort of like, you must do this, then this, then this, then this, then this. And how Josquin takes something so planned and so mechanical and makes it so human is, again...
What's remarkable is that the maths never gets in the way of the music. And that, I think, is the mark of his genius.
Yeah, I think he's really one of those people who uses quite strict forms to create something that seems just very humanistic, and you wouldn't even know that if you're listening to it, you don't hear the forms underneath it. I always think he's very much the same era, almost exactly the same dates as Leonardo da Vinci, and in the same way that da Vinci does that with art, and sort of uses the form of art and kind of pushes it to boundaries. It's the same that Josquin sort of kick-started the Renaissance in music in the same way.
Right, and we heard that even in the opening of the Ave Maria, where he takes what sort of is, here's the rules, but he's going to follow those rules. He's just going to bend them a bit and create something absolutely extraordinary.
Exactly. I think that, the most creative people, they know just how to push the rules, so to create something different and new.
It's really exceptional. So as we prepare now to conclude this episode of Chamber Conversations with a complete performance of Josquin's Ave Maria by Stile Antico, thank you again to Helen and Will for being part of really a true chamber conversation. So I'm Bill Everett, and on behalf of the Friends of Chamber Music, thank you so much for being with us.